We're broadcasting in Nairobi. We are on 94.4. We're in Mombasa on 87.9, 102.5 in Kisumu, 96.0 in Nakuru, 96.7 in Eldoret, 90.9 in Nyeri, 97.7 in Malindi. Of course, we live stream the show. I'll keep reminding you this because this is the first and only 24-hour audio-visual radio station. So you can watch us on YouTube at Spice FM KE. You can watch us on Facebook, Spice FM KE. And also you can watch us via our live stream on Twitter at Spice FM KE. We have a guest in the studio. Ndu, why don't you do the honors of introducing the guest?
Well, definitely this morning we are joined with Reverend Dr. Linda Ochola-Adolwa. And I think for many cases, especially when it comes to matters living and life, she doesn't need much introduction. But of course, we're talking today about an issue that seems to have taken Kenya by storm. When we see reports being written and indicators being given, then we know that there's a problem. And when we hear that the outcry has been quite something, then we have some questions to ask. Of course, today we're talking about the Kenyan church in crisis. And first of all, welcome, Reverend Linda. Thank you for joining us in the Situation Room this morning as we try to decipher what the problem is and where we are going and the cry that Kenyans have, or the different things that we've seen over time. Are we going too far when we say the church is in crisis?
I've tried to reflect a little bit on this, and here's my perspective on this. What I really think is happening here is that the nation is in crisis, and that the church's voice in this moment is not distinct, it's not clear, it's not providing the direction that the nation is crying out for. So I think it's fair to say that, because it is the role of the church to provide the leadership and direction and voice in times like these. Yeah, but I think what's really happening is that we've got a roiling situation in the nation, in the society as a whole, and the hope is that the church would be providing some direction, and that there is the Kenyans are experiencing some type of vacuum. Yeah.
Is that hope something that is well placed, or is it a hope that is going nowhere?
Let me answer you from two directions. Number one, I think the hope and the expectation is correctly placed. Why would Kenyans be looking to the church for direction? I think when you look through the scriptures and when you look through the Bible, there is a place for the voice of the community of God's people with regard to bringing in some sanity and some reason in times of difficulty. And so in that regard, the hope is not misplaced. Let me give you a specific and concrete example. In the book of Exodus, when the nation of Israel had gone into Egypt because there was a famine in the land and so forth, during the time of Joseph, they had settled in there. And then another Pharaoh, other leaders came up who did not know Joseph, and then they began to oppress the Israelites. And the Bible says that they were living under such hardship that they cried out to God. And it's in such a situation that God raises up a leader who is Moses, and he sends him to Pharaoh and to ask him to let the people go. In such a case, then you'd be right in saying the nation is not misplaced in its hopes that in a time of crisis, in times of hardship, difficulty, and struggle, that a voice should arise from among the community of God's people that should provide leadership and in some senses should elevate or should relieve this burden that the people are experiencing. So it's not misplaced.
Reverend, do you know what analogy has just done?
Talk to me.
It has explained why we have locusts.
We could be undergoing one of the plagues. You're a quick thinker. I didn't see that coming. I love it.
As Kenyans say, on a light note. Yes.
I hope we're not going to go through the other 9 plagues. They were pretty severe.
Oh my goodness.
Firstborns, be ready.
Firstborns, right.
Why would you say that, why would you see the reason as to why the church has been silent? Is it because who you're talking about, the men and women of God, have basically become too common, too human, too civilian, that they are also they're among those of us who are also calling out for a voice to come, and they're not really hearing the voice of God telling them this is what you need to do? Is it that the leadership of the church has lost its way, its understanding of its purpose?
Have they become too secular?
It's a fantastic question. Can I hazard 3 answers?
Yes.
3 possible answers. Number 1, the leaders of the church at any given time find themselves having to grapple with one dilemma. One of the dilemmas is the dilemma presented by one of the passages in Scripture, Romans 13, that calls for everyone to submit to the authorities that have been instituted. And so you will find that sometimes church leaders tend towards being conservative in pronouncing themselves on different issues because they don't want to be perceived to be confrontational with regard to what they understand to be the authorities that have been placed in position by God. It is also not the agenda of the church or the job of the church to create a situation of anarchy. And so in many senses, they attempt, I think, to support and not to antagonize. And then some pastors actually do find themselves in that dilemma. I actually had a few conversations with colleagues and I asked, this person was in your presence. Why didn't you call certain issues out? Why do you surrender your pulpits and don't speak back? Because many times we find political leaders coming into the church space. And my thought when I was speaking to that colleague was, you have every opportunity at that point because they're in your presence to have conversation. And they quoted this scripture to me, let everybody be subject to the authorities. So it's one dilemma. And I think it's an honest theological dilemma that church leaders find themselves having to grapple with. The second one is this. How do church leaders engage with the issues and the lived realities of the people without being completely co-opted into political agendas? You cannot pronounce yourself on everything.
Yeah.
You cannot pronounce yourself on everything. And if you do, how do you make sure that you have not left your own station unmanned so that you have now run completely into matters state and you've become the watchdog of all and of everything? Let me give you a third dilemma and then I'll have you, respond to these things and determine whether you want to validate them or rubbish them altogether. The third one is that as a church, and I want to suggest that for me, this one is perhaps the most dilemmic of all dilemmas. Allow me to create a word. It's the most dilemmic dilemma. Is that we as the church have to resolve our ethnic identities and denominational identities before we can begin to speak nationally. I feel like when issues arise, many a times we are unable to stand apart from our ethnic identities or even our denominational identities. And so these are the dynamics color the issues. And it becomes then difficult for us to speak ecumenically or together and nationally. So this is my, suggestion with regard to the silences of the church.
The three of them make sense to me. None of them is justified, however. Because I see, yes, we are human beings. So, of course, as a pastor, you have an ethnic background. Outside the church, you relate with people from various quarters. You have an ethnic background and you have a denominational side of it. But you also understand your role. When you stand on that pulpit, you actually are not Luo, Kikuyu, Kamba. You are not. You're a pastor.
Try telling that to your congregants.
But they know that.
At the height, they know that. But at the height of the 2017 election, it would have been difficult to say anything without being perceived as being partisan.
You'd be a sellout.
Not to this or the other.
Either a sellout to one group or another. And the horror of it is that by the time you've made some headway in your work in ministry or in your profession or whatever you want to call it, people already know your surname. It's difficult in crisis now to change and say, oh, by the way, I'm a Samburu, so anything I say doesn't really fall on either side of the divide. And you want to believe that I sincerely hoped for that. It just didn't happen. It didn't materialize.
But it's true. When you look at the Reverend Alexander Muge, you're giving us the example yesterday. The Reverend Alexander Muge, he was Kalenjin, Moi was Kalenjin, but he stood out and spoke. At the same time, we had Archbishop Manasseh Kuria in this other side, Nairobi, speaking. But yes, you could see Manasseh Kuria, Kikuyu, Alexander Muge, Kalenjin, but
there was
quickly,
also Okulu on the other side.
And there was Okulu on the other side. Yes. But you quickly look beyond that and you see, well, he is not saying we the people, us people or our side. He's saying as a man of God, as a Christian community, this is what is right, this is what is wrong. And I think if the church leaders actually went ahead and said, it doesn't matter how you view me, when I'm coming to preach to you, you don't look at me as, oh, now this Reverend Linda, the way she's talking to me is
by
because
the way, it was Mwana Nzeki.
Ndingi Mwana Nzeki.
Yes.
We don't look at them as Kamba, Kikuyu, We know at the back of our minds that's what
Actually-
they are. At the back of our minds, we know that's what they are. But
That
when
was
they're
a
making
different
that
dispensation, I would
Yes.
argue.
later.
at a different time.
Yes.
But he was still very active during those days.
But in terms
as a bishop.
in terms of fueling the conversation, because a lot of times we're asking ourselves, and this is the question, in terms of participation, how participatory should the church be in national matters? Because it's a bone of contention. Where
Could I take you back a bit before we get to that?
sure.
I want to address what the Reverend has said directly. From where I sit, you seem to be referring to Christian immaturity. The maturity of the Christian brotherhood, sisterhood, congregation. Why am I saying this? Because if I read or if I recollect what the Bible teaches well, it didn't talk about Luos and Samburus, but it talked about Greeks. It talks about Jews.
Jews and
it says
Gentiles.
that the moment you subscribe to this particular way of life, you are neither of these.
Yeah.
Yes, so if that particular concept hasn't been internalized, does it not point to immaturity?
We're not going forward.
I think it's a fair point. You know, people keep throwing out this statistic about the constituency of Christians in this nation. I mean, the popular statistic is 80%. I have to agree with you. Is it really 80%? Is it really 80% of people who really subscribe to this thing and have internalized it and consider the claims of Christ to be paramount in their lives? I think we have a lot of church goers. We have a lot of church attenders. I don't know how many Christians we actually have. And even those church goers and church attenders, I mean, I don't have a current statistic, but at some point in the 80s, Daystar had done a study, just a dipstick, finding out the percentage of people who attend church on an average Sunday morning. It was 16%. It was 16%. And so even if you say that that's very conservative, and let's find some sort of middle point between 80% and 16%, you're looking at about
80% is declared, not necessarily. See, church attendance now got specific.
Yeah.
Okay, you say you're this.
And you take action.
Yes. Do you strive towards meeting some tenets of this faith that you claim to have? And that's where attendance comes in. And indeed, if you took the dynamics even further and brought in gender, you'd find some interesting statistics.
correct.
Yes, and you'd find there's one particular gender that attends this particular church more than this other gender. Yes.
You know, you really make an interesting point. Let me just tease it out a little bit. You're moving us towards the fact that the church and the voice of the church and the impact of the church is not a function of the church leadership alone. I think if I were to tease out what you're saying
Yes.
to its logical conclusion, I feel like that's the direction you're taking.
I am taking that direction.
Without absolving the leadership of their unique role and responsibility, without absolving them. I have to say, though, that where we are at as Christians, I feel like the Christian citizens need to also take responsibility and to demand. I think they need to grow up, number one. They need to grow up. And that, which is what you said, by talking about
precisely what I said.
Maturity.
because if you are calling me, if you want me to come to your pulpit and only tell you how God will bless you, in a sense, allow you to pop your spiritual vitamins on a daily basis.
Yeah.
It means that you're not interested in when I want to come to the pulpit and talk to you about harder issues of structural justice, about righteousness in the nation. You don't want those things. When you want to come for the Kesha for the overnight, December 31st, you just want to tell me how I see this will be a year of great change and transformation. I see your situation turning around. I see God settling you and establishing you. I mean, it means that we are sort of kind of on the periphery of this thing. We haven't really begun to eat the meat of this thing.
We're still drinking milk, as
We're
it were.
still drinking milk.
But
So
then
you do have a point.
It seems to be, though, that is what a lot of people feed on. If we look then at a lot of people who go to church, and we're talking about literally walking into the building, people are going to feed off of this milk. This is what they want. So that I've gone through Monday to Saturday, I get to Sunday, and what I want to hear is these blessings that you're going to pronounce upon me. And I also feel that a lot of church leaders then have taken advantage of this to get more numbers into the building for whatever reason. This is then the crux of what they teach.
They're responding to
They're
their
responding
audience.
to the audience, but still, I don't think that absolves them from the responsibility
Absolutely
of
not.
making it work. So then a lot of people feel that, okay, well, church, I'm not going to go because at the end of the day, it's prosperity preaching, or it is just the blessings that you will get out of this season of famine. Your life will become better. How then do we reconcile that against this maturity that we're saying needs to happen? If these numbers of 80, I think it was 84% even at some point, are actually going to be true.
I have to say, as I said, I acknowledged his point, which was that we cannot overlook the fact that you've got the Christian constituency wanting to hear a certain kind of message. But at the same time, I said we can't absolve leaders of the church of their responsibility. Christian leaders need to understand, and we need to remind ourselves constantly, that we get our marching orders from above. Ultimately, this is not a business. It's not the sort of place where you say you're going to sell what people want to buy. If you have your marching orders and your mandate from God and you're accountable to Him ultimately, you need to keep that at the forefront of your mind in such a way that His dictates, His framework shapes your ministry. Let me give you an example. Ezekiel 34 talks about how God is going to be very tough on the shepherds. He talks about how the role of the shepherds is to strengthen those who are weak, look for those who are lost, kind of round them up and provide for them. And then it actually challenges the shepherds of Israel at that time who were feasting on the sheep themselves. And then God talks about the fact that He's going to do away with them. And so when we remember those kinds of things, actually the net effect is that it should call us back to our senses. This is not a marketplace.
Or at the very least, have some of these churches who propel this other message shut down.
We need to go into that.
Good. We will get into that.
I will want you to repeat that particular book of the Bible and the chapter, because there's something I want to say about it. Yes.
We have in the studio Reverend Dr. Linda Ochola-Adolwa. She's the Executive Director of Hatua Trust. She is a pastor. We are basically discussing the church in Kenya. Excuse me. We are discussing the church in Kenya. Is the church in Kenya in crisis? That's the conversation we're having. It's 19 minutes past 9. This is the Situation Room. It's Kenya's biggest conversation.
Classic soul, R&B, smooth jazz, neo soul, and nostalgic ballads.
Make some noise. Yeah!
You're listening to Spice FM. 96.1 Spice FM. Kisi. Mature, intelligent talk every morning. Spice up yourself. Mornings done right. 94.4 Spice FM, Nairobi.
In the Situation Room this morning, Eric Latif, C.T. Muga Nduoko, and on the hot seat this morning is Dr. Linda Ochola-Adolwa. You were to repeat that verse again because C.T. Muga wants to go further into it.
Yes, and the dire consequences that would befall these leaders, that's the part I mean.
That's the part he was interested in, just for clarification purposes.
Here it goes. Ezekiel 34 says this. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, you clothe yourselves with wool, you slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. Let me skip to verse 7. It says, therefore you shepherds hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, because my flock lacks a shepherd, therefore you shepherds hear the word of the Lord. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. Yes. I will remove them from those roles.
I want you to read it so that the Kenyan leadership who are listening to this understand that there will be consequences for the things that they are doing, because it looks to me like this particular verse, it's like it is a mirror image of what the leadership, a good portion of this leadership in this country have been doing. Thank you. We can now move on.
It also provides a historical perspective.
Yes, it does.
That even in faith, this is not the first time. We see this all the time. This was very many years ago when the church leaders or the religious leaders were doing exactly the same thing that we see religious leaders also doing today.
Hence this complaint.
Today that people are feeling, well, they are doing their own thing and not addressing us. Brings us to the issue of, that prosperity message. People are coming to church, and what we are getting is that prosperity. I'm speaking a blessing. I am prophesying this is going to happen to you.
And if they didn't prophesy, they've not preached.
And they haven't preached. And then everything else is sort of put in the back burner. If we look at how the church has progressed in the country, there are those that we call the legacy traditional churches, the mainstream churches, the Anglican, Catholic, PCA, AIC, Baptist, Methodists, and the rest. And then we have down the new evangelical churches. A lot of people who complain about church will say it's all about prosperity gospel nowadays. Why is it that we have this? Are you saying it's because this is what the people want, so give the people what they want?
Okay, let me jump into that. But before I do that, let me also, I thought to myself as I was coming here that I also need to say, bad news makes news. Mm-hmm. And let me say this in humility, now that I'm in the situation room and you guys could throw me out. Media loves controversy. Can I say this just before I get into your question on prosperity gospel? Yes. Media loves controversy. So I thought to myself, it would be fair when I come to talk about this and we're reflecting on the church and its role and in crisis. There is many a hard-working pastor whose ministry has been marked by integrity, who has made the sacrifices and done time for a long time, who's just putting in a good day's work day after day, year on year, and it never makes the news. I thought that it would be fair to say that. It's kind of like any other sector or any other profession, the legal profession, for instance. You always hear when somebody runs off with a client's money. But there are many other good lawyers who actually put in a decent day's work. And so I just thought, let me throw that in so that it doesn't look like, vilifying every work.
That message has arrived.
Let us surprise you by saying we actually agree with you.
We agree with you. That message sits here.
And I know you know, but I just thought to myself, for the benefit of everybody who's listening out there, they need to hear that we're, sort of there's a balance here. But anyway, on to the question on the prosperity gospel. I haven't reflected extensively on this because people keep publishing and writing. But I think that the prosperity gospel is valid in some places, in some ways. I think that it is a response to the many social ills in our part of the world. You don't need to preach a message of prosperity gospel in a country that is affluent or in a country where people are not living below the poverty line. It is only when I am lacking in employment and lacking in opportunities in my country that you need to call out people who are praying for visas and who are looking for the next ticket out to the next country where they can have a shot at making it in life. And so we need to also, again, be clear and just have clarity about our context. When you look at the unemployment statistics, when you look at the situation of our young people, a friend of mine who's a social commentator said that this generation is facing the most anxious financial future of any. He makes the point that at 29, his father was already married with 3 children, was already espousing a leadership position in society. I think he was a deputy head teacher, and he was already at the place at 29 where he had purchased a plot of land. In other words, beginning to invest for the future. And yet our young people today, within the age range of 18 to 35, one would consider them to be failing in the 5 social markers of what is called adulting. People are struggling to finish school. People are struggling to find a job. People are struggling to find, to marry. Maybe you've got a girlfriend, but you'll just keep drinking coffee or eating popcorn or the cheapest thing that you get, taking her for a walk because you can afford.
Right.
You can't even afford to do anything beyond that. Just take her for walks, and the clock is ticking.
And we're walking.
You're walking. And then the other thing is you want to start a family. Even if you get married, you're like, hold on a minute. Let's just settle and establish ourselves first. And then investing for the future is even a rumor. Something that a previous generation was able to do by the age of 29. And so it is in this context where people have short-term, unrelated internships, if they have anything at all, that you have the context where the prosperity gospel is also finding space in people's lives. It is in such a situation where we want to come to church and be told, goodness and mercy shall follow you. It is true, but you need it now like never before.
But Ndu had actually even alluded to this. So some of them, some preachers have taken advantage of that. Basically, it's like preying on the vulnerable.
And that is all we
You have
hear.
seen that people are vulnerable. This is what they need to hear. And I come in and I call myself a preacher, and this is what I'm going to give them. without necessarily feeding their spiritual nourishment.
I think it's a fair point. You know, the image that comes to my mind is there was a certain time when Matatu started having music. You know, there was a time when they didn't. And then the newer versions would come and they'd have all these amazing colors and they had music. And those were the ones that would draw people. So I almost think that it's a situation like that. People do want to go to a place where they feel their felt need is being addressed. So if you come to a space where I have the platform and I'm talking to you about structural justice and somebody else is telling you how goodness and mercy will follow you, you know, this is the turnaround weekend. Things are going to change for you this weekend. After this prayer, you know, your life will never be the same again. Who are they going to go and listen to? Is it me with the righteousness and justice, or is it the other person who's saying this is the turnaround, complete crossover, prophetic crossover, Kesha? You know.
You know, your question, this is where your question just sits sliding nicely.
Yes, because we do have this situation where you have people who actually take that thing even further. They even give you a timetable within which you can actually receive your blessing or receive your healing.
Miracle
I
Wednesday.
have been of the view that they should be held accountable for these things, because you can't keep peddling false promises. If someone says 10:30, come and receive your miracle, and I come at 10:30 and my miracle is
Not ready and
received.
waiting for me.
You know, this question is so dicey. Every time I listen to you, I want to continue to make disclaimers. The challenge with our industry, like any other, presumably, allow me to call it industry or sector or whatever, is that there are so many people peddling what is false, and that it bears remarkable resemblance to what is true. I cannot, in all conscience, sit here and disavow the fact that when you come into Martyr's Church, you are dealing with the supernatural. Can God come through for people? Yes. Does he turn situations around miraculously? Yes. Does he even owe us any explanations? No. And maybe even if he did, we wouldn't understand it. The problem is then that you do have a lot of other stuff that is being peddled that is not the truth. And you raise an interesting question of accountability. You know, I want to throw this one back to you. How would you hold people accountable in this setting, and specifically even for false promises? You're smiling in a fashion that makes me think I've just walked into the lion's den.
Yes, you have.
No worries. Let's do this.
Keep walking.
Let's do this. Peradventure, God will deliver me like he did Daniel. Hebrews says Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. So let's do this. I mean, talk to me. How would you hold people accountable? Say if somebody, not I, but if somebody says this is the timeline,
This is the weekend.
This is the timeline, this is the miracle, this is the weekend miracle, and it doesn't happen, what would you do? Should such people be thrown into cell? What should happen?
Actually, we've looked at this thing from the perspective of politicians who, unfortunately, a country like ours, we have very low thresholds for actually judging any moral standard that they should have. And people say, well, we expect them to lie. We don't expect the same of religious leaders.
No.
Now, this is where the problem comes in. And then religious leaders tend not to be judged with the same yardstick because of the same element of faith. If we look at the description of faith in Hebrews, it leaves you a little gobstopped, because you'll say, okay, if this is the rule that this person is applying, then he may not necessarily be lying, because it's not entirely in his hands. But where the lie comes in is when you say it as though you are in charge and you're capable of providing it. You state it as though it's a fact. Just bring yourself here, 11:30, miracle, you will receive. Now, that's where the lie comes in. If you say, we are going to pray for miracles, there is no question. There will be no issue. That's what you're doing. But they say, come and receive.
So those that do that, and
Wednesday
that's what she's
miracle
asking,
service,
that's Linda is
kind of thing
asking,
we're talking about.
how do you hold them to account?
Oh, I'm getting there.
He's warming up.
Yes, I'm
Yeah, this
getting
is
there.
this one.
I am saying, then what we call secular law comes into being. Now we remove the element of belief and we say that you, my friend, are selling things which don't exist. And that now becomes a criminal act, because essentially it's not just dishonesty. No.
It's fraud.
It is fraud. Yes. That is what we now charge you with. Because you cannot promise people who believe. It's even worse when you then promise them that if they take their hard-earned money and give it to you, there's a certain multiplication process that will take place. But you carefully avoid the fish and the loaf story, except with reference to the fact that these things have happened in the past. Okay? Again, fraud. It is not, you don't have the power or the ability to make that thing come into being.
And accepting that and presenting that as truth is what is
you
extremely
can represent
important.
the person who is the manufacturer of these things, but
you.
state it so. Stop giving yourself a role that you actually don't have.
The conversation continues at 28 minutes to 10 o'clock. We have in the studio on the hot seat this morning is Dr. Linda Ochola-Adolwa. She is the Executive Director of Hatua Trust. She's also a pastor in the Anglican community. She is talking about the church in Kenya, and that's what we're discussing. Very many aspects of the church. We'll be opening up the phone lines in a short while at 0719-012-600. The conversation continues. Let's first take a look at what's happening on the roads. Good morning.
Classic soul, R&B, smooth jazz, neo soul, and nostalgic ballads.
Make some noise.
You're listening to Spice FM. Spice FM, Nakuru. Traffic.
So the folks along Feather Nyayo and Airport Road have decided that they will also join the foray, and we could see some protests from Monday. So enjoy the good traffic that you have now, because they've decided that if they've seen this has worked in Wiki Kasarani, perhaps they can get some answers as well. All right. And it seems that the folks in Kawangware, which you mentioned earlier this morning, Eric, seem that they also want to join this. Lorry catches fire at some parts way up on Mombasa Road, and that has caused some traffic as well. Not an explanation for the heightened traffic that we see this morning, but that is a happening situation right now. Okay, coming off Thika Road, not so bad right now because it has, of course, eased off as we've passed traffic hour. Getting into the CBD is a lot easier. Of course, Ngong Road has cleared up now, getting to the City Mortuary roundabout and then entering into the CBD, not a problem either. So yes, traffic hour is over. For those parts where we see the remnants, you will get where you're going just in time. You see anything that we should spread the word about, Spice FM KE is the Twitter handle, or give us a call, 0719-012-600.
96.1 Spice FM, Kisi. Mature, intelligent talk every morning. Spice up yourself. Mornings done right. 94.4 Spice FM, Nairobi.
As we continue the conversation with Reverend Dr. Linda Ochola-Adolwa, let's also bring you some breaking news. The MP for Embakasi East, Babu Owino, has been arrested. Not for derogatory statements made, but for a shooting incident at a club in Kilimani. So he's been arrested. He's been taken in over a shooting incident at a club in Kilimani.
Is it the only one who's been arrested?
For today.
Over that particular incident? We'll find out as we go on.
Okay. Now that you brought in the politicians, maybe I need to give you a little background. We've had discussions in this very studio about the peddling of lies by politicians. And why I call it peddling of lies is when politicians stand up and make promises about development that hopefully, in Kenyan style, will bring to people, and years down the line, nothing happens. We have been of the view that that amounts to a lie, and it continues. There's always, with every election cycle in the process, we even give examples of very really senior government officials talking about projects that they said would be completed by a certain time, not completed. And then we even had examples of people who are in politics saying that about the same government that, in my area, where I come from, where I'm the leader, we have 128 projects that the government said they would complete. They are not completed. And it goes on. And we said, no. It ought to be actionable because they don't need to make those promises. You don't even need to say you're going to do this. You could just keep quiet. Or you could just say that one thing which you know for sure you are able to do.
And stick with it.
And this example goes on now. When you have a situation where the church joins in this fray and they're also being characterized by statements that cannot be held to be true, that's why I said they become secular. And that is putting it really politely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I wish you would go for the jugular and just call it what it is. I can see it in your eyes and in your throat.
It wants to come out.
Yeah, maybe it is the title Reverend that's holding you back. I hereby give you my pastoral permission to proceed without fear. Permission to speak freely is granted.
Yes.
Let me say this. I really appreciate what you've said about politicians and given it as a background and then come into the religious leadership. So let me just start from where you've started from. With regard to the Kenyan situation and the fact that you've got political leaders who constantly tell us that they're going to do X, Y, and Z and don't deliver on their promises and still manage to get elected, I want to kind of circle back to a point that you had made earlier. We talked about immaturity with regard to the church. I also want to suggest that there is immaturity with regard to our citizenry. And certain articles that I have read have also talked about the fact that when a society is low on trust, it tends to over-legislate. I think that is what is happening in Kenya. We have laws upon laws upon laws,
Yes.
and commissions upon commissions upon commissions that have been set up to deal with all these things, anti-corruption and the rest, all manner of interventions at structural level. And we are finding that despite all of these things that have been created and put in place, you still have a society, a runaway in terms of morality, runaway,
Immoral
an immoral society, completely immoral society. My 2 cents on this is that you also have a situation where the citizenry is complicit in this situation. I mean, I cannot control your lying to me. I cannot control what comes out of your mouth. But surely I have the power to remove my ears by commanding my legs to leave this room. I don't have to listen. I don't have to buy the things that you are saying. So I want to say that about our political leadership. And then let me move quickly to my sector. It's best to stay in your space. Let everyone stick to his own lane.
Lanes, please.
Let me speak about my own lane. I want to suggest also that when you see a situation where people are constantly having promises made to them that don't come through, and they are essentially in the hands of unscrupulous leaders, and they continue to entertain, allow me to speak with stronger language than you did, they entertain that nonsense. It tells me that perhaps you were right in your first calling out of the issue when you said that there's an immaturity and we maybe have our own selves to blame. We have no excuse, I think, as Christians to continue being naive and gullible. The first time you tell me that this thing will happen by 10:30, perhaps I have no track record with you, or I'm not aware of your track record of reliability.
Yeah.
How do you justify my sitting in that space on an ongoing basis, even when I have seen that there are challenges?
Benefit of doubt.
Benefit of doubt?
Second time, third time,
How many times?
until immaturity.
Until immaturity. I thought you were going to quote a scripture to me, at which point you'd have tied my hands. Let me allow me to do the quoting of scriptures. But let me say this. I listened to a presentation by a professor of law, Professor Kameri Mbote, and she was talking about the limits of formal law. Because you're talking about, you're basically calling such pastors fraudsters. Let me use your word.
Actually, yes.
You're treading so carefully when it comes to matters sacred. But you've called it fraudsters, and I call them fraudsters. I don't think you're wrong. But she talks about the limits of formal law, and she talks about the fact that you can legislate and legislate and legislate. How many people can the prisons in Kenya accommodate? Maybe let me put it like that. That's where I'm going. If we are going to throw people into the slammer, every time Eric tells a lie, Ndani. Ndu, Ndani. Linda, Ndani. I mean, so who's going to be left out here?
Right.
There must be other social norms and customs that are able to govern and shape our spaces. Let me give you an example that she gave from her presentation. She said that with regard to the Kenyan law, women can inherit land. But then she said in many places, custom still rules. Women cannot inherit land. So there are
in
other...
most places.
In most places. Thank you for being very candid about that and giving it to us real. The fact of the matter is that there are many places where custom holds the water. And my suggestion is that in spaces like the church, do we not have recourse as the people of God, as the community of God's people? And we can only come to that place where we ourselves have a high sense of ownership of the space. We have clarity with regard to the word of God. In other words, we are even reading it for ourselves.
Yep.
So that when we begin to sense that somebody is kind of skating on thin ice, we are able to speak back and call it out. Some of the things I've seen, honestly, online on Kenyan TV, there is no justification. There is no justification for some of the kinds of abuse that the Kenyans are enduring at the hands of religious leaders. And yet these same constituencies continue to go back time and time again.
To those same leaders.
I think the point I'm trying to make here is that you cannot legislate morality. And there is a responsibility on both sides.
Okay, but still, there can be an attempt to regulate the church,
Okay.
regulate religion.
Okay.
We've seen it happen in Rwanda. We've seen, attempts even here.
In terms of the
where
licenses
where
that
the
are
church
given.
leaders have come back and fought hard. Among the things, if you start from the basics and say, if you want to be a minister of the word of God, then you must also, meet some certain minimum
Basic
requirements.
criteria,
Just
yeah.
Basic criteria for you to do this, for you to get yourself licensed, for you to operate. Why is it that the church would fight so hard against and push back against the issue of regulation?
On that one, I
It's
have
like
to
fighting
say...
transparency.
Yeah, on that one, I have to say I am in agreement. A certain friend of mine gives an analogy and talks about the fact that you would never let untrained personnel go into a hospital to perform surgery.
Right.
He makes this analogy. And then he says, however, with regard to matters church and matters spiritual, as soon as somebody wakes up and says, I feel the call,
They're
the
done.
next day you're admitted, we bandika you a title. And nowadays, even it's not just humble pastors.
We make you bishop.
Apostle,
Apostle.
super apostle. I mean, I do feel that there are excesses. I think I'm just trying to acknowledge that there are excesses, and that I would not be opposed to some type of regulation. I think the question then comes again: who regulates?
Right.
Who regulates?
Why can't the church regulate itself?
I think it should regulate itself. That's where I was.
Because if you don't regulate yourself and you allow the government to come in, and then you know who's going to regulate you? Kenya Bureau of Standards.
Yeah.
God forbid.
Well, yes. I mean, after all, remember,
And we'll each have the KEBS mark or
yes,
Of course.
certification.
the gospel is a product, okay? And they will set standards by which this
And
particular
the Kenyan
product
National
can be
Examinations
consumed.
Council, whatever you've done, it must be NEC certified. All
Yes.
those things. It's important that we
I
get
think
to
it needs
a
to
point where the church
self-regulate.
comes together, and
Yeah.
the media did the same. When there was issues of the government trying to regulate the media came back and said, all right, so let's do this. Let's organize ourselves. We're going to regulate ourselves.
Yeah.
That's how come we have the Media Council of Kenya. Law Society of Kenya is a means of self-regulating. All these
Yeah.
institutions have that. I think it's about time that, and it requires leadership. It requires somebody in the Christian faith and leadership to actually say, you guys, let's sit together. Let's make the move. Let's take the initiative to start some sort of regulation.
And I think that there are some initiatives going on. I do not know all of them, but one particular group called Hesabika Trust that I am familiar with at this point is almost to the final stages of a draft document for governance for
Accountability
churches.
Trust, is it?
Yeah, for governance for churches. So that's a good thing. And I kind of perused through that document just briefly this week, and it talks about what are some guidelines for churches with regard to raising funds. What are some guidelines for churches with regard to their boards? And the average pastor who has been through theological college like I have to say, I didn't learn that, about boards and their role in theological
Governance.
college. Those are things that I learned on the job afterwards. Now, forget about even that pastor who hasn't been through, those basic minimum requirements that you're talking about, hasn't been to a Bible college and has a sense of calling. So there is some attempt. I know, as I said, this one body that is trying to do that. I think there could be others, but it has been difficult. I do want to suggest, though, strongly to the church leadership with humility that the time has come. And we cannot put this off any longer, or we risk exactly what you're saying, an external body coming in to regulate us, which is fraught with its own challenges. In fact, the scripture says that if we do not, clean our own house, it talks about the fact that righteousness must begin with the house of God. We must be able to clean our own selves up first so that we have the credibility to speak into the other sectors of society.
In looking at the running of a nation, I mean, just briefly, how do you think then the church should be involved? How close should these two relate?
Church and state. We'll come into that. The Reverend Linda will be responding to this. Over the short break. Forget it. It's 13 minutes to 10 o'clock. This is the Situation Room, is Kenya's biggest conversation. Also opening up the phone lines now, 0719-012-600. We'll pick one or two calls in the studio this morning. Reverend Dr. Linda Ochola-Adolwa. She is a reverend in the Anglican Communion. She's also the executive director of Hatua Trust. Good morning.
Classic soul, R&B, smooth jazz, neo soul, and nostalgic ballads.
Make some noise. Yeah!
You're listening to Spice FM. Online, mobile, and on radio. This is Spice FM. .1 Spice FM. Kisi. 96.1 Spice FM. Kisi.
Let's go to the phone lines because we have Sami calling in from Magarini. Good morning, Sami.
Yes, good morning, everybody.
Good
morning to you.
Yes, I'm quite fine. Yeah, I have some suggestions maybe for the bishop, if I'm not wrong.
The title
Bishop
of bishop
not
has
yet.
now been conferred upon you.
Sammy, why didn't you just go directly to Pope? Why did you stop at Bishop?
Linda is fine.
Yes.
Okay.
Go
Yeah,
ahead, Sami.
I think by going by the BBI report is that they suggested that the charges will have to be registered, and then whatever they'll be doing business, any business that the churches will be doing will have to be actually audited for. So whatever funds, whatever rambles that will go on in church, they have to be published and put on the wall so that the congregates or the members have to see and scrutinize if indeed the money that they contributed actually went to whatever purposes they were intended for. I think that's one point I congratulate BBI. But also I must say that we remember Karl Marx when he said that, get rid of these churches, which are the opium of the people and the soul of the soulless. I think we are having commercial churches. Even if when you go to Europe, you see most of the churches have closed down. People have gone home. They just remain with the Biblia or the Bible. They read on their own because of this such a commercialization of churches.
Yeah.
They need a lot of money than what we get from our own sources. We need money to purchase some of our items, food, clothes, and whatever. But they demand more than what they should actually be demanding. We know they have to survive on our side or the
So there are
offerings,
costs.
but they're demanding a lot of money. So I think they should be regulated and they should be kept on toes and to be responsible for whatever money that we contribute to churches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sami. Talking about financing and management of finances. We've actually had that conversation here. And, it's even been floated here that how about just ensuring that all churches draw from the same kitty? So that's all taxpayers. Like, was it in Germany? Where all taxpayers...
Oh, it's not just Germany.
In many
there are
other countries.
where there is a tax that if you subscribe to a faith, you don't actually need to go to church to give the tithe. You are taxed.
You're taxed. And then the church just draws the money from there.
No, they don't necessarily draw the money from there. That money exists and it could be used for development. It could be used for all sorts of things. Yes. That is government tax. It doesn't mean that when people go to church, they then don't give.
Because you see what Sami is saying, that churches are becoming a burden, a financial burden on people.
On who exactly?
That's what he's saying.
I know, and I'm asking the question because churches, how are they a burden? Because this whole process is voluntary, really.
Kabisa. That's an excellent point.
You don't have to go.
There are churches, and you even talked about, there are churches where you go and the pastor says, if you don't have, for those with, now the basket is going around for those with 1,000, now the basket is going around for those with 500s and with hundreds, and now thank you very much. The rest of you guys, you feel the pressure of how much you need to contribute. It actually does happen in this country.
And what stops you from leaving that church if you're uncomfortable?
Which is really where we had reached. Let me say something with regard to Sami's...
I like what the pastor says. I just don't like when he asks for money.
You want to be blessed, but you now don't want to chotter for the blessing.
Yes.
Which tells you that many of us are very double-minded. Here's my humble submission to his contribution. In the churches I've worked for, actually, the income of the church has been properly handled by trained finance and accounting practitioners, and audited accounts have been published every year. And so, and I don't see that it has stifled our ministry at all. So on that one, I agree with him. The truth of the matter is that the church is an organization like any other. It's an interesting one because it is fully human, but fully divine. But with regard to the fact of our humanity, we must put in the controls, financial controls, like any other organization. For instance, as a pastor of a local congregation, I was not the one, I sort of worked out the budget, but I sent that budget to HQ, and that budget was scrutinized by others. And then, whereas I could write requisitions together with the staff team of my small congregation, I wasn't the same one who was able to do all sorts of things like actually going to the bank and getting the money myself, taking it there myself, accessing it myself. There are all sorts of controls that make it possible for us to really establish that we are running a credible outfit here. I don't see the place for us to object.
I tell you, Linda, in that ministry, that was moving closer to what we call the mainstreams.
Okay.
The others don't. And you know this.
You throw the offering bag in the boot, and drive off in a cloud of dust.
Yeah, in terms of accountability, in terms of what was done, then I mean, it's been really, honestly, some of the things that we've heard is mind-boggling, and it's really quite disturbing that we get to that point where the offering that people are giving, of course, which they hope that you chotter for the blessing, is now something that is being used for totally different things.
And these are churches where the entire practice of that church borders on cultism.
Yeah.
And the leader of that church just stops short of calling themselves God.
Yeah. We have excesses. I cannot deny that. I mean, I'm living in the same context that you are.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we have a problem. I think he's right that I don't know whether I don't know whether we are heading there to the place where these things will be regulated for the churches externally. I hope we don't get there. I hope we can get our act together before we get to that point. But we do have a problem. I, for instance, have major problems when I see religious leaders living at a standard that is far above that of their congregants. There is nowhere that I see in Scripture that makes it possible for religious leaders to live a life of opulence in a context like this. It doesn't make sense to me that people can own a jet. In fact, what happens at that point is that it becomes impossible for you to challenge the political leaders.
Yeah.
Right.
Brings me back to Ndu's question. How far should the church be involved with the state? Allow me to allude to a story again in the Old Testament. You have a story where there was this guy called King Ahab.
It's Friday.
It's okay, it's Eric.
Thank you. So Ahab had a really super kind of evil wife called Jezebel. People know this name. And this woman was from a foreign nation, and so she did not fear God, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, and didn't subscribe to the 10 Commandments and everything. And so Ahab, one day while he was walking around, he saw a vineyard next to his palace, and he was like, Kaprot, I like it. This thing looks good. 2020, let me start off the year on a good note, expand my investments. And he wanted this, and he spoke to this guy. The owner of this vineyard was called Naboth. Now, there was a law in Israel that said you could not sell land. You could not sell land, and the reason was because there was an intention to preserve approximately access to the means of producing wealth. And so land was retained by
They
families.
wanted to maintain equity.
Exactly. And so Naboth says to the king, God forbid that I should sell the inheritance of my fathers. And of course, he's got a long-term view of things. When I'm gone, my kids will have something.
Yeah.
And so Ahab goes to his house and he's in a foul mood. He's sulking. He will not eat. He turns his face to the wall. And Jezebel comes and asks, what's
up?
going on? What's up? And he gives this story. And then she goes to she says to him, she snaps her fingers and says, nonsense, watajua hawajui. Let me sort this thing out for you. And she basically compromises the elders and the courts of justice, and she's able to accuse this guy falsely, get him executed, and then tells
Takes
her
the-
husband, now go and take the
Take
Now,
the
now
land.
you have the land.
Now enter Elijah, who was the prophet. And just as this guy is going for an evening walk on his newly acquired property, Elijah says, comes into this space, and Ahab asks, what are you doing here? The long and short of it is, I'm saying the church should be involved. It should be involved to the extent of speaking truth to power. It should
Very.
be involved.
Very, very powerful words. As we conclude
And it's
on
difficult
this,
for us to do that when we compromise ourselves by living the same lives of opulence through gains that people cannot explain where we got them from.
Questionable.
Questionable
questionable
gains.
gains.
Absolutely.
Final question before you leave.
All right.
Is there anywhere in the Bible where it says, God helps those who help themselves?
No.
City. Justify.
One is a popular saying, but it's not a biblical saying.
So where does it come from? Is just somebody
I
who...
tried explaining this to my
To Eric.
Yes, to these agnostic colleagues of mine, and I told them that saying came from the first president of the country, and he himself quoted God. Maybe God had told him personally, but people assume therefore it was in the Bible.
God helps
Those who help
themselves.
The Bible does say faith without works is dead. It also says that whoever does not provide for his family is worse than an infidel. It also says that we should work with our hands
whoever
and not
does
be
not
busybodies.
work should also not eat.
It also says
all those
that.
things.
So
Thank you very much, Reverend. We have had in the studio Reverend Dr. Linda Ochola-Adolwa. She is the Executive Director of Hatua Trust. Thank you for joining us. We'll invite you shortly, in a couple of weeks, to come and let's take stock of what you've been saying. Part 2 of this.
Asante.
As we go into the weekend, we want to thank you very much for tuning into the Situation Room this week between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. every Monday to Friday. Say goodbye, CT.
Goodbye.
And happy weekend.
Happy weekend.
That's all.
Goodbye. Happy weekend. I follow instructions.
All those going to the political rallies this weekend in the name of BBI and the rest, we wish you all the best. See you again here on Monday, bright and early. Or you'll have, of course, the drive and the adults in the room later this afternoon. Between now and then, you'll have uninterrupted music. This is The Situation Room. It's Kenya's biggest conversation. We broadcast this show every weekday between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. We'll see you again on Monday. My name is Eric Latif. We have CT Muga Nduoko, and we've had our guest on the hot seat this morning, Dr. Linda Ochola-Adolwa. Good morning and goodbye.
Spice up your life. Spice up your life.